I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 90. Today on the show, we're joined by Randy Newberg to discuss the greatest threats to public lands and public land hunting in America. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Sick Gear. And today, as I mentioned, we've got Randy Newberg on the show with us again. And Randy joined us last September for a conversation in which we discussed a lot of different conservation and hunting related topics, but we didn't get to really dive into one of Randy's favorite issues, and that's public lands. Now, fast forward to January, a month ago, and we had Whit Fosberg from the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership with us on episode number 87, I think it was. And during that interview, we discussed what Whit believed were the most important conservation issues of 2016. And one of those was this threat of the transfer of public lands. It's been talked about a lot these days. So coming out of that conversation, we've been getting lots of questions and comments from listeners and readers wanting to better understand what exactly the deal is with this public lands transfer idea. So in short, we decided that we need to have a full episode dedicated to this very topic and public lands and all the various threats to them. So it seemed to me that there's no one better to discuss this with than Randy Newberg. So obviously, we now have Randy Newberg on this episode, which I'm excited about. And if you didn't catch our first episode with Randy, I'd highly recommend giving that a listen. It's episode number 72. But if you haven't done that, and if you're not familiar with who Randy is, he's first and foremost just a serious hunter, both for deer and other big game species. He's the host of Fresh Tracks with Randy Newberg on the Sportsman channel, I believe, and the Hunt Talk radio podcast, which I'm a big fan of. He's also a board member for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and a very active advocate for hunting in public lands. So with all that said, this is going to be what I think is going to be a terrific conversation focused on one of the very most important topics for hunters today. But that's just my 2 cents. Dan, what do you think? Are you ready for this? Are you excited about this? Do you think this is going to be interesting?
Yes, I do think it's going to be interesting. So from a political standpoint, I have never really been into politics at all. Never. Mm-hmm. Like, I despise politicians type of view on life. And this year, I got a little bit of a fire under my seat, and I said, you know what? I'm going to pay more attention to the political field, and I'm going to start, really honing in on what candidate really meets as many values for me as possible. And I know that today's episode kind of correlates with what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm looking forward to seeing what Randy has to say about some of that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I think he'll have some great perspective as far as hunters who are active in the political arena and, getting involved and making sure that the hunter's voice is heard. Randy is one of the most active out there that I know of. I know he's frequently talking with people that are making these decisions, going to Washington, D.C. or going to the Capitol in Montana or whatever it is, and he's making his voice and the hunters' voice heard. So I think it's going to be interesting to dive into these public lands issues and maybe some of the other things surrounding the politics of hunting and habitat and all of that. These topics can be sometimes a little messy, right? Politics is something that people can get pretty fired up about. And it's funny you mentioned that you really haven't paid attention to politics much in the past, but now you are. I've been kind of on like a roller coaster ride. Like there's a period of time where I was like really into it and I paid a ton of attention to it and I was like super gung-ho about what I thought, and then I kind of fell away from it. And then again, some number of years ago, I was like really gung-ho and I felt like I had really strong connections with certain parties or people and things like that. And now I'm back on the backside. I'm kind of down the bottom side of the roller coaster again, where me personally, and this is just me, but I'm very disenchanted with a lot of things going on in politics today and in Washington, D.C., and in all of our various state capitals. What's happening? There's a lot of things going on that I'm just kind of not happy about. And a lot of I don't know, it's just gotten so nasty, so divisive, so polarized. And so I kind of have removed myself from any type of political party. I'm just a person. I'm a guy who's interested in trying to find someone who's going to stand up for hunting and for our Second Amendment rights and for our public lands and for wildlife and wildlife habitat and all these things that mean a ton to me, and of course other things too. But it's getting really hard, at least for me these days, to find anyone that really meets all those criteria.
Right.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you with our options these days from the one that everyone's talking about right now is the presidential race. So without getting into too much, how do you feel about our options as a hunter?
As a hunter, as far as I'm today, I did research on some of my breaks at work and found out that a majority of the Republican Party candidates that are still out there, not all of them, but a majority of them are serious about transferring federal lands back to state management.
Yeah. And we'll avoid getting into that right now. We'll wait till Randy gets on to discuss, why that's something that I think you and I are both personally concerned about.
Right.
But yeah, that's concerning. And then on the other hand, though, here's some, and I hate to dive too much into this because it inevitably pisses people off, but I get really concerned when I hear things like that because these guys and gals want to get rid of some of these public lands for one reason or another. So I'm like, okay, that's something I definitely don't agree with. But then you've got other people that are running where, you worry if so-and-so gets into office, what does that mean for our right to bear arms and hunt with different types of weapons and all these things. So as far as I'm concerned, there's no candidate that I can see that I'm really comfortable with who can check all these boxes for the sportsman.
It's all like voting. When you vote, it's always the lesser of two evils. And I hate that it has to be that way. Yeah,
very true. It's, I was just vacuuming today. I was vacuuming, sitting and thinking about this topic and just saying, that's exactly it. You have to pick your poison and what am I willing to compromise on? And unfortunately these days it's like either way you're compromising on some pretty big issues.
Right.
So I guess because of that, that's probably why a lot of hunters just put their heads in the sand and don't want to get involved in this kind of thing at all and just say, I want to go out and hunt and just do our thing, which is great and good. And we all love doing that too, but unfortunately, I think there's so many things happening today, Dan, that we've talked about in the show and other points that are kind of demanding that we hunters need to start getting involved more, or else, change is going to happen, and it's not going to be the change we want to see.
Yeah, and at the same time, we need certain hunters to maybe not voice their opinions on certain subjects. Jesus, can I vent? Is it okay if I vent?
You can vent. But
how much time do we have?
We've got like 10 minutes to vent, but we got to make sure we don't. Well, I'm going to let you say whatever you want to say because it's your opinion.
Okay, so here's the deal. this is the straw that broke the camel's back. So typically, Mark, you know me, I'm a pretty laid back guy. I go with the flow. I never am too fired up about anything. I roll with the punches. You know, it takes a lot for me to get really worked up about specific, you know, really anything. I mean, my daughter or son has to really crap on the carpet like 7 or 8 times before I get mad at him. You know, that kind of. I'm
and that's like before you even clean it up, or just before you get mad.
So anyway, at work, right? So anyway, at work, there's this board, and on this board at work, it said, long story short, every month there's a new phrase or a question on it, like, what's your favorite baseball team, or what's your favorite picnic food, or, you know, something like that, you know. And this one was,
Can I say pause?
Yeah.
Sorry. This is totally not the topic I thought you were going to go down. I thought you were going a different direction with this.
I know, but it will lead back to it.
Oh, it does. Okay.
Yeah.
So sorry. Continue.
So today, this month, February, is what is one reason that you want to live a longer, healthier life? Something along those lines. And I never take part in this board, never take part in it. And one day I'm sitting there eating my breakfast burrito, and I'm looking at this board, and the first thing that pops up into my head, you know, because other people have already written, you know, I want to spend as much time with my family as possible. I want to see my grandkids grow up, that kind of stuff. And so I walk up there and I write, kill a 200-inch whitetail. And that's what I wrote on this board. Now,
Yep.
for the listeners of this podcast, that probably doesn't, I mean, Mark, would you want to kill someday maybe a 200-inch whitetail?
I mean, that'd be cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the reason I hunt, but it would be one. I mean,
It'd be awesome if it
yeah,
happened.
it'd be awesome. So, you know, it's not my main hunting goal, but it would be cool if it happened, because obviously from a statistics standpoint, killing a 200-inch buck is a rarity. And so I go back to my desk and I'm like, oh yeah, okay. So I participated.
Which was good. You participated in workplace culture, Dan. You were being a valuable member of society. That's a positive thing, Dan.
Right. So later that day, or I think it was as I'm leaving yesterday, someone erased my comment.
Now, you didn't actually see them doing it, right? You just saw that it was erased.
I saw that it was erased. And I'm like, it kind of ticked me off a little bit.
Yeah.
So this morning I come back to work. I write up there again, kill a 200-inch whitetail. And someone erased it again.
Are you serious?
I'm dead serious. And
wow.
I'm not the kind of guy to make waves in the workplace just because, you know, I go there, I get my work done, I participate, and I try to make the workplace better from a process standpoint, and that's my job. And then I got this in the back of my head, like I'm thinking about it all day long. What would happen if I erased somebody else's dream or goal up there? How would they feel? I'm like to the point now where I've talked myself into potentially going to human resources to bitch about it. I don't know. Is that something that maybe I shouldn't get worked up about and just let it go with the flow? Or is it something, I mean, I feel like of all things, it like is now where I make my stand.
I can understand. I can understand where you're coming from. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that if you erased someone else's thing and they found out about it, someone would be pretty upset about it and would complain about it and say, Dan doesn't respect the fact that I want to live a long life because I'm a Democrat, or because I love my grandkids, or because I love the Michigan State Spartans, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty unfair that they can do that because you're a hunter and maybe they disagree with that, and do it twice and think they can get away with it. So I don't think I think it's a fair thing to talk to someone about.
I mean, and that's the thing, like maybe and the first thing I thought of was, okay, maybe they're offended or they're worried about the word kill,
right?
Which still, anytime you eat a hamburger, you're responsible for killing a cow, right? If you take part in that, you have to be somewhat responsible.
Yeah, man. The thing is, and right when we talk about this a lot, people are so disconnected from reality when it comes to things like that, you know? And I think it's interesting you bring this up because last week I was at the SCI convention in Las Vegas. That's Safari Club International. I was there covering it for Outdoor Life, kind of examining some of these issues and topics that have been in the news a lot with trophy hunting and conservation and stuff like that. And there were a bunch of anti-hunting protesters outside the convention and petitions online trying to cancel the show because of these different auctions for gear and guided hunts and different things, and they're calling it pay to slay. So I don't mean to derail your story, Dan.
No.
I just want to mention one thing. It's interesting. I happened to be leaving the resort to go get dinner, and as I walked out, I walked actually right through this group of anti-hunting protesters who were on the corner of the street, and they're all there, still talking about Cecil the lion and killing these beautiful animals and how bloodthirsty we are and et cetera, et cetera. And I just kind of stood there looking at these people and their signs and the stuff they're saying, and it's just kind of like unbelievable. Like, do you know what you're saying? Do you know what you're talking about? Like, they're wearing leather shoes, leather belts, wearing their leather purses. They're, I'm sure they're going out to dinner, going to have a steak tonight. I mean, there's so many people that are disconnected from reality, and they see what we do as hunters as barbaric, when in short, we're simply just actively participating in something and taking responsibility for it ourselves that is happening even, they are doing the same thing in some ways, but just allowing a surrogate to do it for them, and they feel better about it because they don't need to be involved in it. Interestingly, though, I was standing there at the crosswalk waiting for the light to change, and I had all these guys and girls all around me with their signs yelling and screaming and stuff, and I'm standing there just waiting to cross the road, and I look in front of me across the road, and I see there's a newspaper photographer snapping pictures of all of us, and I realize I'm in this picture with like 40 anti-hunters, and I'm like, oh geez, don't get me in this picture. I'm not with them.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So that pissed me off a bit, and then I go back to my desk, right? And here we are. Me and you talk about this a lot, that if you're going to be an advocate for hunting, make sure you have the facts, and I think you knew one of my complaints as far as hunter retention is concerned is that in my opinion, there's certain hunters that we may not want to be the voice for our hunting just because they're the, hey man, if it's brown, it's down, the beer drinking, that kind of stereotype hunter.
Yeah. I know what you mean.
And then I go online and I'm reading this article, which is in a newspaper. This newspaper person this journalist goes and interviews this person. I'm not going to say his name, but he has a television show and he says booyah a lot. And so that narrows it down. And he's given this reporter all this information that is completely false about chronic wasting disease. And I'm just like, now people who aren't hunters are going to read this, and they're going to think that this CWD isn't really as big of an issue as it really is.
Or that hunters are a bunch of idiots.
Exactly. So yeah. I'm sitting here and I'm just fuming, and that kind of dumped fuel on the fire for this little comment that was erased of mine. Something so typically innocent that, I didn't say I'm going to gut shot a buck and watch him die over a 3-day period. I didn't write that. I wrote kill a 200-inch whitetail. And it's just somebody, and that's why I'm no longer a people person.
I'll tell you what, guys, Dan Johnson is coming in hot today.
So I'll get down off my soapbox, and I apologize if I kind of went off on a tangent. That's what we do on this show.
That is what we do.
But you know what I mean? It finally has just built up to the point where I'm just like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, it's kind of scary, some of the sentiment these days outside of the hunting community. And it's something we talk about a lot. Actually, the last time we had Randy on, we talked about this. We talked about the importance of perception and how the non-hunting public perceives hunters because they have a ton of power. And if we start having these bad apples continue to give us a really bad name and keep changing that public perception, all of a sudden we're going to start losing our privilege and right to do these things that we love to do. And as you can see, there's someone in your office who didn't even want you to be able to talk about the fact that you like to hunt.
I didn't even talk about it. I wrote it in chalk.
You guys are still using chalk?
Well, it's this little paint on board thingy.
Okay.
So, but yeah. Anyway, We should probably, before I start dropping F-bombs.
Yeah, fair enough. This is a good time to stop. I completely understand your frustration, though, and I think a lot of people listening probably can too, because I think there's I hate to go down this road, but there's like definitely some what's the word? Gosh, why am I? Wow, Dan, help me out here.
Scapegoats, hypocrites.
Man, I've never had this hard of a time thinking of a word.
Use your
but
big
we
boy
are
words,
being,
Mark.
yeah, I know, we are being treated differently than others, negatively, because
Right.
of what we do as hunters. And there's a
And
very,
we don't
easy
do
word for
anything
that.
bad.
Right, exactly. So it's an issue, and it's something that I think because of the continued urbanization of our population, I think it's going to continue to get more and more frequent. It's going to happen more often. It's going to be more severe. More and more people are disconnected from hunting and what we do and why we do it. And it's something we have to be really cognizant of. So,
Right.
man, do you think we should we, do you want to keep talking about this, Dan, or should we shut it down and bring Randy on and make this a 3-person discussion?
Yeah, we better. I mean, he's the expert, and he's probably the guy that before guys like me and you start throwing punches, he's the guy going, "It's not worth it, guys."
Yeah. Randy will be the voice of reason for us today.
Exactly.
All right. Well, then let's take a quick break for a word from our partners at Sitka, and then we will give Randy a call. So, as we do every week, today we're going to hear from Sitka Gear product category leader Dennis Zuck. And specifically for this episode, I wanted to hear about rain gear and what factors into creating really high quality rain gear for deer hunters. So here's Dennis to explain.
Yeah, I mean, for me, anything that keeps you in the woods longer is important, and rain gear is a perfect example of that, so it's either going to keep me in the woods longer, or if I went on a long hunt and I don't get to pick the days, it might be the thing that lets me hunt that day where I get the opportunity. So it's super important. And I think when you're thinking about, what makes good rain gear, I think you need to think a little bit about what you're trying to do with it, and you need to look at where your rain gear comes from. So if I'm going to put it as a cover suit, I need to make sure it's sized in a way that's going to let me put it over top of my garment. So that's something that's important. But I think where it comes from is really important. Having spent a lot of time with the folks at Gore-Tex over my years, all rain gear is not created equal. If you turn that rain gear inside out, you're going to see seams. Those need to be taped. Those need to be sealed. They need to be done in a way that works well. It needs to have a hood that's going to run the rain off appropriately. It needs the pockets that it doesn't run into. It needs to do a lot of things to protect you when you're sitting and when you're standing. So think about all the things you're going to do in your rain gear. Think about who's making it, and are they paying attention to those details that maybe I don't see. I think those are the parts that make a bulletproof system, for that rainy day hunt.
So, if you would like to learn more about Sitka Gear's rain gear or other items, visit sitkagear.com. And now, let's give Randy a call. All right, with us now on the show is Randy Newberg. Welcome back, Randy.
Mark and Dan, thanks for having me. My pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to chat again. And, for the past 10 or 15 minutes, me and Dan have been kind of going all over the place on issues related to public lands and politics and anti-hunters. And we've had a whole heck of a conversation already. So we're excited to bring you in as the voice of reason today, is what we're hoping you can be.
Oh, no. the thing just completely went off the rails when you bring me in.
Yeah. So before we get too far into all those fun topics that we do want to talk about, last time we chatted, I think that was in August maybe, it was just before you were about to head off on your fall 2015 hunts. So I was kind of curious, How did your season end up going?
Oh, you guys know how it is where some seasons it's like everything falls into place, and then some seasons, no matter what you do, it doesn't work out. Murphy's Law, it can't go wrong, it will go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Mr. Murphy was riding shotgun with us this season. It was so hard. I've told people if I hunted this hard in most seasons, I would have filled every tag with a blue and crockett animal.
Oh, man.
As it was, we probably filled half our tags. But oh well, we we got to see a lot of cool places, did a lot of cool things. We had great guest hunters who shot some nice animals. Just when you're out doing the public land gig like we do, and I know your audience is going to be like, "Oh, Randy, I really feel sorry for you.
Right.
You get to hunt 100 days a year." My sympathies. But we had a decent season, but for how hard we worked, it should have been better. But that's hunting. You know, you guys know how that is.
Yeah, definitely.
Sometimes you work your butt off and you don't get what you deserve, and sometimes you're sitting on your butt and it just lands in your lap, and you're like, all right.
Somebody needs to tell me what that's like.
Yeah, Dan's ready for one of those.
Yeah.
It'll be there, Dan. The next time you climb in the tree stand and you turn around just to get ready, here'll be the big buck standing right down below you looking at you.
That would be
Ready.
nice. That would be nice.
Promise you.
Yeah, you know, now as I'm remembering things, I think our first interview with you, Randy, it aired the week that me and Dan were out on our elk hunt together, and we had one of those elk hunts. Now it was only a week compared to your, whole season out there, but our week of elk hunting in Idaho was kind of right in line with what you're talking about, with kind of everything going wrong. We just got poured on the whole time, and Dan didn't bring a good tent, so his tent went debunk on our first night. So we had to pack out to get him new gear because everything was soaked and nothing was talking, and there was way more hunters than I've ever found back there. So it was just one of those trips where you look at it as a learning experience, and that's about it.
Well, you got to have a few of those so that you really appreciate it when the good ones come along.
Very true. Very true.
That's how I rationalize that, anyhow.
You have to tell yourself things like that in the pits of despair on a mountainside, right?
Right. Exactly.
You did, if I remember hearing, you did get a nice bull. Was it in Montana?
Yeah, I did. I lucked out, and this was one of those days when Mr. Murphy was on vacation, is all I can figure, because we walked out on this small sliver of BLM land, and the idea was we were just going to glass from that big knob out there, and lo and behold, there's 3 bulls and 20 cows just tearing it up, rutting, carrying on, making noise, and I ended up shooting one of them, and he ended up being the best bull I've ever shot.
Wow.
So that just goes to show. You go out to glass. I was so unprepared to actually shoot, because I was just thinking about, okay, I'm going to glass for the evening hunt and figure out what we're doing this evening, and all of a sudden they start bugling below us, and he wanted to be a TV star, so I obliged him.
Gotta love those attention-hungry elk, right?
Yeah, so it was fun. We went to New Mexico. Our guest hunter shot a really nice bull there, and in Wyoming we had a guest hunter shoot a bull there, and I continued my whitetail addiction. In Montana, I shot another whitetail. So
Nice.
I've lived here for 24 hunting seasons, and I've filled deer tags every year, which in Montana is not super hard with the number of deer we have, but I've only shot 3 mule deer in my entire time of living in Montana. All the rest have been whitetails. So that's the problem when you grow up in northern Minnesota. You can't get rid of the whitetail or the walleye problem.
Yeah, I can definitely I can imagine that. When I think most people think about whitetails in Montana, at least from a Midwestern perspective, I think of like eastern Montana, Milk River and stuff. Are you traveling way east to hunt whitetails, or are you finding some over on the western side?
There's whitetails all over Montana. I shot this whitetail at about 6,000 feet of elevation on the Forest Service.
Wow.
All the elk hunters they just march right past you. I cut up this one drainage and sit on this ridge, and whitetails being whitetails in November. He was the 6th buck that I saw that morning, and he was the one that actually decided to stand for the camera because I was filming myself.
Wow.
Which was really hard. And so he was nice enough for me, and I shot him. But I think if people from the Midwest came out to Montana or Wyoming or Idaho whitetail hunting, they just shake their head at, 1, how little hunting pressure there is. 2, the average quality of a lot of our bucks relative to highly pressured places that I grew up in Minnesota anyhow. And just how much country there is to go and find them. I shouldn't be saying that.
Right.
All my Montana buddies are going to be like, Newberg, shut your mouth.
Yeah, you're telling a pretty big chunk of whitetailers out there about your secret.
And where's that trailhead located?
Yeah.
Well, then, if you wouldn't have to ask too many people because they see my truck parked there regularly. I'm going to have to start driving like a Toyota Prius or something because people see my truck. They're like, oh, I know where Randy was at. And I'm going, darn it.
That's funny.
No, we're lucky to live in a place like Montana where we do have all this public land and people, I think, people believe if you can hunt whitetails in Montana, you need private access, and there's no doubt that's going to help you. But with a little legwork, the ability to, or desire to hike a little bit, maybe a pair of waders to cross a creek or a river that keeps other people from crossing, you'd be surprised how many whitetails you can find here on public land.
Yeah, it's definitely intriguing to me. It's funny you mention it because over the past few weeks, I've been sitting here at home trying to figure out what my third state should be because I typically hunt my home state of Michigan, I go to Ohio, and then a third whitetail state. And I've kind of moved away this year from doing one of the usual ones I do, like something close to home. I've been thinking, like, this is the year maybe I'm going to head west for, like, a totally different kind of western hunt, maybe North Dakota, maybe western Nebraska, maybe Wyoming or Montana. So these are the things I'm thinking about. So it's interesting to hear, your perspective on that because I've heard that from a lot of people that there's a lot of great deer hunting out that part of the country that people just don't know about or don't realize is available. So
yeah, well, if you decide to come this far west, you guys just give me a call and I'll tell you where those GPS coordinates are, Dan.
Careful.
But you'll be sworn to a vow of secrecy.
You got to be careful what you offer, Randy. Dan's liable to take you up on it.
That's just fine.
So
we'd have fun.
So speaking of public lands, though, right? What I really was hoping we could talk about today, Randy, were a lot of things related to public lands and some of the current risks facing our public lands. And I know that you are a guy who has worked for quite a long time now on behalf of public lands, public access, and those places and animals that we as hunters have the opportunity and privilege to hunt. So I guess I wanted to cover a lot of things, but the first and foremost aspect of this is this whole issue of the transfer of federal public lands. It's been talked a lot over the past year or two. Most recently with the whole standoff in Oregon, there's been a new light shined on it. It's been talked about a little bit in regards to the presidential race going on right now. So it's definitely in the media. It's something that people, I think, need to have a strong understanding of. But right now, I think there's still a lot of questions, especially for guys that are, our audience here in the Midwest, East Coast, South, wherever it might be, who aren't necessarily are as involved as maybe someone in Wyoming or Montana or Nevada is, where there's tons of public land. So we talked about this issue a little bit. A couple weeks ago, we had Whit Fosberg on the show, and we spent maybe 5-10 minutes talking about this topic. But I was hoping that you, Randy, could help us really drill into it. So could you maybe, to really start us out here, could you explain to us, what is this issue? When someone says the transfer of public lands, what are they talking about, and why do these people want to do something like that?
Well, I'm not sure how much time we have, guys, because we could spend a 24-hour podcast on this one. But I'll try to touch on the high points that are relevant to hunters. And the reason I say hunters is in the West, 70% of hunters in the west of the Great Plains, hunt on federal public lands. So that's why it's a really big issue to hunters in the West, just because it's where most of us hunt. But the premise of this argument is that the federal government should transfer the lands to the state and let the state manage them. And, when you first hear it, it's like, oh, yeah, what the heck, not a bad idea. And for a lot of people who live in a state that their state lands are very friendly to hunting, it really sounds like a good idea because they think that all states operate maybe the way their state does. So I'll use the example where I grew up in Minnesota. Just about all the state lands are open to hunting. Pretty much all the state lands are open to most everything. Then you come to Colorado, And I'm just using some examples here because usually these examples will illustrate the concerns very quickly to the listener. So you come to Colorado and you see on the state land there are these little blue squares on your map. You cannot hunt those state lands. So we got 23 million acres of BLM and Forest Service in Colorado that if it was transferred to the State Land Board of Colorado under the premise that this whole state transfer idea is, those 23 million acres of currently accessible federal lands, the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, would no longer be available for us to hunt unless the Department of Wildlife in Colorado went and leased the hunting rights on those lands. Well, they don't have the budget to do that. The reason I use Colorado is it's such an obvious example of how each state has different rules about access and restrictions on the state lands that are controlled within that state. It's not like federal lands where if you go to Montana, to Michigan, to Georgia, to New Mexico, the federal lands are all pretty much the same access rules. It's very, very different by state. So in that example, let's just walk it through. The federal government transfers all those BLM lands to Colorado. How are we going to replace 23 million of acres that right now is currently open to hunting?
No options, I don't think. I don't know how you could.
I don't know how it is. So, and people say, well, he's just using one really bad example. Well, let's talk then about New Mexico. New Mexico state lands, you cannot camp on the state lands. So I hunt the Gila National Forest area for elk a lot. Now, if the Gila National Forest was transferred to the state of New Mexico, I could not camp out there on the grounds where I'd elk hunt. Well, it's about a 3-hour drive on some of America's worst roads from the nearest place I'd be able to camp to where I would hunt. Well, how practical is it for elk hunting that I'm going to drive 3 hours every morning, hunt, drive 3 hours at night to come back out to where I'm now allowed to camp, and repeat that process every day in my elk hunt? It's just not practical. In New Mexico, a lot of the state lands that have a lot of wildlife values get considered wildlife management areas, and only residents can hunt those and apply for tags in those wildlife management areas. So I'm just pointing out the real obvious examples. In my state of Montana, we were like Colorado until 95, I believe, is when we went to Helena and got in it was an ugly dust up with the legislature. And what came of it is that we agreed we'd be willing to pay a fee if we would be allowed to hunt state lands. So now residents and non-residents get to hunt state lands in Montana, but they have to pay a fee to do that. So if any of you who travel to the West, I assume if 70% of us living here hunt on federal lands, the odds are 70% who would travel here to hunt, or close to that, would probably hunt on federal lands. So
yeah.
It's a huge impact. So just in that sense of what would happen under state control and ownership is one thing. If you step back and don't let yourself just be drawn into that argument, but you look at the history of this discussion. This discussion has been going on for decades. And the premise of it is that the federal government should not be allowed to own land, that it's unconstitutional. In spite of the fact that that's went to court many times and it's been defeated every time, these people still hold that out as some sort of myth, or I call it constitutional fiction. But the goal of those groups saying this is to not just get the land transferred to the states. Historically, their goal was, let's sell these lands. And so in the late 80s, they really were pushing that. It became what was called the Sagebrush Rebellion. And they got their teeth handed to them from a political and just public opinion standpoint. So they kind of retreated for a little while and said, boy, let's not say sell the lands, let's call it something else. So that's where they came out with the new idea, the new package they wrapped around it called transfer the public lands. the reason that they do that is the western states are very, very good at selling their state lands. Nevada at statehood was granted over 2 million acres of state lands. They've sold 99% of it. Utah was granted over 7 million acres of state land of land at statehood. They're now down to a little over 3 million. Alaska currently sells their land to fund their university systems, their school system, and their mental health system. So if these states obtain the ownership of these lands, the goal of selling them, which has been the goal of most people behind this, would be far easier to accomplish if these lands were in state hands than when they're in federal hands. So it's really two issues. The easy argument is to say, look, this is really going to affect us from a hunting access standpoint. And the evidence is there. It just takes 5-10 minutes to explain it. But the longer term goal is to get these lands out of public hands. It's that simple. And it struck me that just 2 weeks ago, and for your listeners, there's a group called the Mountain States Legal Foundation based in Denver. They're a large think tank of attorneys who are very much into property rights, Western land issues. Some of your listeners may remember Gail Norton, who was the Secretary of Interior under George W. Bush II, James Watt, Secretary of Interior under Ronald Reagan. Both of them came out of this think tank called the Mountain States Legal Foundation. And why am I bringing that up is because just in the last couple of weeks, as they've seen more and more publicity for this idea of transfer, they've now come flat out, and the president of that organization, who's also an attorney, William Pendley, wrote a very long article, and the title of it, I have it right here, says, "The federal government should follow the Constitution and sell the Western lands." So now they're back to, we called it transfer. Let's just say what we want it to be. We want to sell these Western lands. And the part that strikes me as funny is here's an attorney, William Pendley, who says the federal government should follow the Constitution. Well, if he's an attorney leading an organization with lots of other attorneys who specialize in this law, why don't they just file a lawsuit and say, hey, this is unconstitutional. Get it turned over. That seems like an easier path. The reason they don't is because they've been defeated every time they've tried it. So their hope is if we can continue to make it sound like it's unconstitutional, if we can make it sound like this is big government against the little guy, we can accomplish this legislatively. Because we've not been able to accomplish it judicially, let's try to get Congress and public support to accomplish this. So it's just been recent in the last month now that they're back saying, let's just sell these lands, which surprised me because it was such an unfavorable advertisement for their cause 25, 30 years ago.
Now, I know, me and Mark before the show started had a little conversation about, and I'm just saying this presidential election year, I've been focused more than I ever have on politics. And with this, and I've done some research before this show, and one term that kind of strikes me funny is, and especially I think Ted Cruz on the Republican Party has been saying, we want to return the land to the people. Well, if it's public land, isn't it already the people's land?
Yeah. Isn't that funny? When he says that, I just laugh. I'm like, aren't we the people? Isn't this a government for the people, by the people? So, yeah, when he says we want to return it to the people, I'm not sure what he means by that. So, I laugh when I see those same clips because you see him out on YouTube or some of the social media where he's saying, we got to return this land to the people.
Is this trying to gain public opinion? Is this like a stunt to try to gain, public acceptance rates so that somebody would say, you know what, these guys are right. We need to sell all this land.
Yeah, I think that's what it is, guys. In its bigger picture, If it was really a constitutional and legal issue, there are very smart minds at, I gave the example of the Mountain States Legal Foundation. There are very smart legal minds in many places that are promoting this cause. If it was strictly a legal and constitutional issue, it would have been in courts and solved a long time ago. It's been in courts many times, and it's always been solved against their favor. So now the mantra, the narrative, the talking point is these lands are a burden, these lands are this, these lands hurt, the rural West, blah, 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 blah. And it's building and kind of backfilling a legislative effort that we're starting to see at the state level in the West, and we will be seeing at the national level. I've been to D.C. twice in the last year on this issue. And you see a lot of now national level politicians taking that as the narrative going forward on public lands. Let's just sell them. Let's just give them to the states. Let's sell them. And so I do think a lot of what we're hearing, a lot of this effort, a lot of the volume being turned up is part of that longer term strategy they have to convince Americans that these lands are a burden, they're a pain in the butt, blah, blah, blah. Let's just sell them. And, if they are able to accomplish that, well, shame on us.
So I want to dive into a few of the things you mentioned there, Randy. Dive deeper into some of the motivations for some of these things, a little more of the history. You touched on some of it. But before that, I kind of forgot to speak to this at the beginning. We've mentioned it before, but I just want to reemphasize the fact that this really is an issue that isn't just a Western issue. This is also something that I think should be very important to a whitetail hunter in Michigan, or a turkey hunter in Georgia, or a grouse hunter in New Hampshire, whatever it might be, because, this is, first and foremost, there are national lands and national forests and federal public land, not just in the West, but all across the country. I mean, there's tons of deer hunters hunting national forests in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, West Virginia, Ohio. There's huge national forest lands in places like that if all these types of things happen, now, if you're one of those public land hunters, you're in serious trouble. On the other hand, if you are a private land hunter, even as private land hunters, we complain about issues with increasing hunting pressure and struggling with finding places to hunt and different things like that. Well, what happens if millions of acres of public land all of a sudden start getting sold off in your neck of the woods? Now you're going to have a whole lot more competition to try to find somewhere to hunt, even if you are on private land. And then, third, if you ever do have a dream of someday going out and hunting deer or elk or whatever it might be in one of these other Western states closer to you, Randy, that I think a lot of people do have a desire to experience, whether it be to hunt, fish, camp, hike. If you have a dream of someday doing that, well, this is going to have a significant impact on that future for you or your children or your grandchildren. So I just want to jump in here and reemphasize that this isn't something for whitetail guys in Louisiana to turn your ears off to. If you're in Texas or Michigan or Indiana, I mean, this is something that I think all of us hunters need to stand up and take a stand on. It's not something just for Randy Newberg in Montana. This is also something for Dan Johnson in Iowa.
I'll just use an example that's been effective with some of my friends who, again, I grew up in Minnesota, and you're in Iowa. The Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife Refuge is between Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. And the number of friends I have who deer hunt there, waterfowl hunt there, it gets a lot of hunting pressure, simply because it's trade hunting. It's near places where hunting access would be difficult. These proposals are to sell that. So who's going to be the guy who goes and buys that prime whitetail ground? Someone's going to buy it. And I don't think they're going to say, oh, everybody come and hunt my great whitetail hunting here in northeast Iowa or southeast Minnesota or western Wisconsin. I suspect they're going to say, hey, no trespassing here, folks. And so there's so many federal lands. I don't care if we're talking boat ramps where you launch on the river, that when you start rolling back the covers of what this argument really is about, it's an argument of we don't want public access as it currently exists to be there. And we want these lands in the hands of private parties because we have a ideology that private industry is where things should be. And I don't argue that private industry is efficient. I mean, I've started and built my own businesses, and I'm thankful for the returns on that. But I think in this country, we also, one of the things that makes our country so great is we do have these public lands. We do have opportunities for the average person to go to hunt, to fish, to bird watch, whatever it is. And that makes us different than other places. And if politicians think that they want to sell all of these wildlife areas, all of these boat ramps, all these fishing access sites, well, for me, it'll be the old over my dead body. It's not going to happen, and I don't care where I live. My attachment to hunting and fishing in the outdoors is such that I'm not going to stand there and just let it happen. And the argument I use with a lot of the politicians who are trying to push this is I give them the studies that were done by the National Shooting Sports Foundation that say the number one reason people quit hunting, the number one reason they don't hunt as much as they previously did, and the number one reason cited for why they don't get into hunting if they come from a hunting family is accessible lands. So how do you go on this idea that we should get rid of all these lands the public uses for this hunting access and yet try to convince me that you're in favor of hunting? I'm not buying it. So that's why, to me, it's very important, no matter where you live in this country, because the public lands, the federal lands in the southeast, in the northeast, in the upper Midwest, probably get a far higher use rate than the private lands as far as hunter days per acre, or however you'd want to measure it. I grew up in northern Minnesota. We had Superior National Forest. Over in northeast Minnesota, we had Chippewa National Forest, and the deer hunting pressure on those lands was intense, and it created opportunity for hundreds of thousands of people. So now we're going to sell those. Where are those people going to hunt if they don't have the money to go buy some of it themselves? So,
yeah,
it's not just a Randy Newberg in the West issue, I guess, is the point that you brought up, Mark, and I completely agree.
Yeah, it concerns me that different factions try to position this as one thing or another, or they'll try to position the groups that are fighting for protection of these public lands as anti-hunting. I don't know if you've seen any of the green decoy stuff, but some of that stuff's ridiculous, and it's trying to split hunters up and say this isn't an issue for you, or this is an issue that environmentalists are pushing, so you shouldn't support it. And I just want to make very clear, by having you here to discuss these things with us, that this is a hunter issue, not just a certain type of hunter, not a certain type of person. This is an American hunter issue that we all really need to be aware of and take action on, right?
Yeah, I agree. And the thing is, if you want to get a politician worked up who claims to represent hunters but is supporting this cause, I just tell them, well, your actions are the same as the anti-hunters. Oh my goodness, you want to see their blood pressure spike. And I just tell them, look, the studies show what you are proposing is one of the huge obstacles we face in hunting, accessible places to hunt. Why are you hammering us? Why do you want to take land away from us? And for the most part, I don't have an answer. They usually, as politicians are good at, they usually change the topic. Or they give some party line of this or that. But
yeah.
What kind of... Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I just was say it is a real and present threat. I used to just kind of push it aside like, oh, that'll never happen. But now seeing the amount of money that is behind the effort, seeing their strategic plans that they have at a national level, mostly in Congress, it is no longer a just fringe element that you can ignore. The time has come for hunters to take it seriously.
So they sit there and they say, okay, well, if you sell this state this land to the state, then the state sells it, and that's going to help maybe boost the economy of that state just a little bit, get some money flowing into the economy. But at the same time, when you take away hunting land from the hunters, I'm sure there's got to be some kind of negative effect to the economy as well. Is that something you'd like to speak on?
Oh, I mean, I'll just use examples in the western states. Rural western states, and I'll even dial in more in my state of Montana. The little outlying communities used to be, hunting season was their second harvest season. You could not get a motel room. You'd have to stand in line and wait for a seat at a restaurant. The gas stations were just, bumper to bumper with hunters gassing up. And over the last 20 years, there's been a lot more of leasing of property, or there's been property that's been bought up that it's people who just, they don't want any hunting. They don't lease to an outfitter. They don't lease to a private party. They just want wildlife, and they don't have any hunting. That's really impacted these small communities in rural Montana because they no longer have this big influx of hunters because there's no place, or far fewer places to hunt. And hunters have just said, you know what, I'm not going to drive 10 hours, 12 hours just to go someplace and not have somewhere to hunt. So that's just a very small example, but there's a lot of examples where the hunting economy is very important to rural America during times of the year. And right now we're seeing a big bust after a big boom in oil and gas economy. And if there's one thing that's always been there with the hunting economy, the recreation, outdoor economy, it's been pretty predictable and pretty consistent. It's not subject to the booms and busts of a lot of our other stuff. But I think at times we as hunters have a tendency to not interject that, but it is a very important part to many of the places that we travel to hunt.
And I think another thing worth noting is that these public lands, they aren't just used by hunters, but also fishermen, hikers, campers, horseback riders, in many cases, whatever it might be. And that larger, not just the hunting industry, but the tourism industry as a whole, I think is really substantial. I think if I remember correctly, it was either Montana or Wyoming I was looking at, that's like the number 2 industry in the entire state. So, I mean, we're talking serious money, right, Randy?
Yeah, you are. And, it struck me is, out on my forum, I have a big web forum called Hunt Talk, and we've been talking about this a lot. And one of the people sent me an email and said, did you know this was going on in Wisconsin? And so he sent me all the information, and in, I think it was late 2013, Wisconsin passed a law that said they have to sell 10,000 acres of state land. And they identified it's got to be landlocked, or not landlocked, got to have difficult access, blah, 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 blah. And so I posted a comment out there about it on my website, and I could not believe how many Wisconsin guys showed up and either posted or sent me private messages that said, I may not hunt that land, but I use that land to get to this lake or to get to this fishing spot, or I trap that land or whatever. And so there's a whole lot of other activities going on these lands. And when I heard all these comments from Wisconsin, it really opened my eyes to how many other uses there are to these lands for outdoor people besides just the fact, how I look at it is, hey, I like to hunt there. So it was quite an eye-opener to me.
All right, now before I go ahead with my next question for Randy, we do need to pause here for a brief word from our sponsor of today's episode, Trophy Ridge. And Trophy Ridge is a company that makes archery accessories such as sights, rests, quivers, and stabilizers. And I've been using their gear for several years now. And one of those items I've been using is a sight called the React Pro. Today, I want to really quickly tell you why this sight is so cool. Now, the React Pro has all the standard features of a high-quality sight, 5 pins, bright fiber optics, a heavy-duty body and hardware, but what really makes the React stand out is how you sight it in. And here's how it works. First, you sight in your 20-yard pin as usual, using the toolless adjustments to move that pin up or down, left or right. Once you have that taken care of, though, the real magic happens. Now you sight in your 30-yard pin. But to adjust it, you simply turn one single knob that adjusts that pin up or down, along with your 40, 50, and 60-yard pin. And just like that, in about the same time I've been talking to you, your 30, 40, 50, and 60-yard pins are all sighted in. It's crazy, I know, but the mechanics of this sight take the distance between the 20 and 30-yard pin that you set and then extrapolate that out to determine where the 40, 50, and 60-yard pins need to be. And remarkably, it really works. So, if you'd like to learn more about the React Pro or any of Trophy Ridge's other accessories, you can visit trophyridge.com. And now, let's get back to the show. Yeah, and I think that's another one of those pieces of the puzzle here that sometimes gets overlooked, that these types of changes, if we take away these landscapes, it's impacting a whole lot of different people that we need to bring all these different people together to support what we're trying to do here, protecting these public places. I want to take a step back though, because when someone looks at this issue, they hear about it, maybe a soundbite, there's like some common questions like, well, why is that bad? Or why would they say that? And we covered a little bit of it. But one of the pieces that, one of the lines that we hear a lot, and you'd mentioned it earlier, is the fact that this is a constitutional issue. The federal government, this is federal overreach. There's a lot of federal government haters that are saying that this is an issue of the federal government trying to take too much control and they shouldn't have all this land, et cetera, et cetera. Can you explain the history of how states got certain allocations of land and the federal government got certain allocations of land in some of these states out west where this is a super, super big issue? Because I think a lot of people don't even understand that. And then that, I think when you do understand that, some of these other things have less power when so-and-so says it.
Yeah. So the way each state was admitted to the Union is slightly different. So we all have what are called enabling acts. In other words, the act that allowed the state to become a member of the Union, of the country. The original 13 colonies became states under a way different premise than, say, Arizona, which I think was 1912, or Alaska and Hawaii, which were 1959. But and there's always this statement of let's give the land back to the states, is what you'll commonly hear. And that's such a false premise because the states never really owned these lands. When Thomas Jefferson bought from France the Louisiana Purchase, which covered most of the Missouri River drainage all the way through Montana and Idaho and to Louisiana, that was federal land. It wasn't like the states at that time, which were, it was all indigenous people living here at that time. It's not like they ever had that land. So that in itself is a false argument. They know it, but it sounds good to say, well, let's give it back to the states. Well, the states never owned it to start with. But so let's then think about, and again, I'll use Montana just because I live here and it's a relevant example. When Montana became a state in 89, I believe, the federal government said, when I say they gave Montana 2 sections out of each township. For those who are not familiar with township range sections, every township is 6 miles wide by 6 miles north and south. So you have 36 square miles within each township, and each one of those 36 square miles is considered a section. A section is 640 acres. So when Montana became a state, the federal government said, we are going to grant you, for the funding of your school systems, Section 16 and Section 36 in every township within your borders. That's what you will get as your lands to fund your state schools. Montana then signed its enabling act that said, we agree with that. We hereby relinquish all of our rights, blah, 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 to any future claims to these lands. They did that. Everyone went along. Hey, great. We're happy. Montana tries to make some money off those lands so that they can fund their school system. That's how these lands became state lands. The state, or the federal government, retained rights to all the other lands. And then through the Homestead Acts and other stuff, the federal government granted lands to private individuals through other legislation. But that is how the states ended up with a lot of land in the West. And in the West, we had different enabling acts. The enabling acts, I think, pretty much since Nevada forward, and Nevada is a strange situation because it's if you think about Nevada, its motto is called Battle Born. I think it became a state in 1863 or 64 during the Civil War. And even though they didn't have the population or otherwise to really meet the requirements of being a state, the North wanted more states on their side. So they admitted Nevada to the Union. And they did it in a way that some say, oh, it was kind of a mess and it wasn't done right, da-da-da. But Nevada was one of the first Western states that gave up rights to any of the federal lands within its boundary. And then you go to Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, all the rest of them kind of followed that same path. So the Western states, their enabling acts, when they became part of the Union, they specifically stated we will give up any future claim to these federal lands in exchange for getting, as I explained, Section 16 and Section 36. In Utah, they didn't get 2 sections out of each township. They got 4 sections out of each township. So each state ended up with a different percentage of land granted to them by the federal government that said, hey, you can now lease these lands, you can develop them, whatever you can do with them to raise money, it should help fund your school system. And still to date, these lands in Western states are a big source of funding our education systems.
And that's an important... Sorry, Randy. I was going to say that's an important thing to note, right? That these state lands are there for not just some of the same mandates that are on federal land, but for the states, it is a funding source. It is something that's supposed to be used to profit and to pay for whatever things need to be paid for within the state. So that right there, I think, speaks to one of the great risks of transferring these lands to the state is that you go from lands managed and owned by the federal government where they have to be managed for multiple uses. So some of that will be leased, maybe some of that will be for habitat, some of that will be open to hunters, fishermen, hikers, etc. When that goes to the state, that all changes, and all of a sudden this could all of a sudden be looked at simply as a profit center. Isn't that right?
Correct. That is correct. All of the Western states, when they became states, they set up these state land boards to hold these lands. And they're called state trust lands. And if you ever look at a surface map, they're the light blue squares on your surface map. So these Western states set up these state land boards, and constitutionally, the state land boards are required to manage these assets, these lands, for a profit. So I'll give you a great example of what happens when they're not profitable. Oregon have the same requirement. They have a state land board, and anyone who knows Oregon knows there's a big timber industry in Oregon. So in the fall of 2014, after years and years of litigation by groups who didn't want logging to happen on what's called the Elliott State Forest in Oregon, one of their most highly used state forests, they were losing money because they could no longer generate timber proceeds. Well, they sold it. They put it up for sale. They didn't sell it. They put it up for sale. They notified everybody that, hey, we're going to sell this because it's losing money. Constitutionally, we have to do this. Well, that created a big stir, and everyone got upset, so the land board kind of pulled it back. Now, last I heard, it was that they couldn't find a solution. They can't continue to hold it anymore, and I believe that land has been sold or is being sold. And that's 90,000 acres of state land that's going to be sold to private parties because that state could no longer make money.
And that's land that's land that hunters have been using to this point, right?
For years, yeah, for years. So Utah is really pushing this heavily. So they did an 800-page study. They hired this group to do a study of could Utah afford to take over the federal lands within its state. And the economists who did this, they came forward and said, well, if oil and gas prices stayed, and I can't remember it, they had a bottom threshold of $70-some a barrel and kind of a break-even threshold of $90-some a barrel, that then Utah could afford to pay for weeds, roads, maintenance, pay the taxes that the federal government currently pays on these lands, blah, blah, blah. Well, what's oil and gas at right now? Last I checked this morning, I think West Texas crude was hovering right around $30 a barrel. And the long-term forecast is going to be under $50 a barrel for a long time. So how would Utah, under that scenario, pay for all these lands they're now going to take over that we currently have access to hunt. Well, the reality is they can't. And their constitution says they would have to sell them, just like Oregon is going to sell the Elliott State Forest. So it's, again, on its surface, and for anyone listening, small government guy, I'm a CPA in my other life. My job is to disinherit the federal treasury. I mean, my daily life is arguing with the IRS, so I fully get the government overreach, the headache, all that. I come from a logging family. I don't need any more than what I already have for life examples of those frustrations. But what's happening is people with a motive of getting rid of these public lands are using these frustrations in this crisis to try and leverage their long-term goal to get these public lands out of public hands. That's what it really boils down to.
So let's speak to something you alluded to there a little bit, the management of these lands, and how, could the state afford to handle management, and you explained how that would be a struggle for a lot of states. But what about on the federal side? Right now, one of the arguments that these pro-transfer, pro-sale of public lands people are saying is that, well, the federal government is mismanaging all these lands. It's horribly managed. It's not handled well. The states can do better. What do you say to that, Randy?
Well, I was in Congress testifying in front of the House Natural Resources Federal Land Subcommittee last April, and I was there to talk about the economic value public lands provide in Montana to our small businesses. Also there was an economist, very smart guy, who said, here's all the things the states do better in managing lands that the federal government doesn't do. He talked about the fact that the federal government charges about 1/8 to 1/10 of the lease rate for pasture grazing that states charge. That they charge half of the coal royalty rate. They charge only like 2/3, sometimes a half to 2/3 of the state oil and gas royalty rate. So he went through this big list of things where, in effect, Congress is giving away a lot of value on our federal lands that the states, by their constitutions, can't give it away. They have to charge the most. So the pro-state takeover, whatever you want to call it, the pro-transfer Congress people in that committee were patting that guy on the back, that economist. Yeah, that's right. That's how the federal government is kind of messing things up, and how the states do such a great job, blah, blah, blah. 3 weeks later, the Secretary of Interior goes in front of the same committee and suggests those changes that this economist had just mentioned. Those same people who thought the economist was a genius now tell the Secretary of Interior what an idiot she is. It's like the problem of how these lands are managed lies at the feet of Congress. Congress could change it if they wanted to, but they don't want to. When we say the feds, the damn feds this, the feds that, the feds are Congress. And anything that the feds are currently not doing with their lands that the states are, the feds could easily do that if Congress had the gumption to stand up and manage those lands the way they should be. But they don't. There's some in Congress who do not want those lands managed properly, because if they were managed better, that would defeat their long-term argument, their long-term goal.
Do you think that there is some of that actually happening, in that members of Congress or these committees or whatever are purposely starving the Forest Service budget or the BLM budget or other things just to help improve their argument that the federal government can't manage these things and that they should be transferred and then eventually sold?
Absolutely. I have no doubt about it. And the fact that a bunch of Congress people sitting on the House Natural Resource Committee, the committee in charge of these lands, would say, yeah, that's why the states do such a great job. And then when the same exact, almost verbatim recommendations are made for how the feds could improve the management of those lands, those same Congress people run the secretary out into the street screaming and yelling at her. That tells me these people have no interest in proper land management. It's about ideologies. And so a lot of people may not be aware of how wildfire funding happens in the West. So the Forest Service owns a lot of the public timberland in the West. And when the Mississippi River floods, or a hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, or an earthquake hits California, or tornadoes hit the Midwest, who shows up? FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. Congress issues us an appropriation and says, we're going to take care of that natural catastrophe through a special funding from Congress. That's not how they do it with fires. A lot of people think that's how they do it with fires. Here's how it works with fires. Congress says, Forest Service, here's your budget. Oh, yeah, we're cutting it more this year, and we're cutting it more this year. And when fires flare up, you better put them out. We're not giving you any money to put them out. You have to take that money out of your operating budgets, your budgets that were there for roads, that were there for water maintenance, that were there to get timber sales done, blah, 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 blah. All that money gets taken away from operating budgets to use for wildfire fighting. These same people in Congress who complain about the feds refuse to set up a separate funding mechanism for the natural catastrophe of wildfires. Why wildfires get treated differently than, floods and tornadoes and hurricanes, I don't know. But if you want to raise the hackles of some congressman who wants to take your public lands, go suggest to him that he change the funding for how wildfire fighting is funded. His eyes will bug out. He'll get livid. He'll tell you what a stupid idea that is. And those of us who aren't in D.C. all the time are kind of scratching our heads saying, really? Why is that such a dumb idea? So the flip side of that thing is they will say, well, the Forest Service has a big backlog on road maintenance. They have a big backlog on weed control. They have this big backlog for this and this and this, and you guys didn't get enough timber sales done this year. Well, if all of the foresters and timber managers and road people and everyone else are out fighting fires, and all their budget is allocated to fighting fires, or half of their budget, how are they supposed to do the rest of their work? So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of them wanting the federal government agencies to be underfunded. And I'm all about, being as fiscally frugal as possible. But you also have to give them the resources to do the job that you ask them to do. And Congress could fix a lot of that, but they don't want to.
So
any other person would be fired for sandbagging.
Yeah, you would be. I mean,
and
how could you? I mean, if Congress was, say, we were shareholders, and Congress was the board of directors of a corporation, and the board of directors was given a proposal by some consultants to say, hey, we can get a much greater return on your assets. One of our competitors is doing this. We would like to do the same thing. But your board of directors said, no, we reject that idea. The shareholders would remove that director or that board of directors immediately. I mean, we would laugh at the stupidity of that happening. But in Congress, you're allowed to do that. And as you can probably gather, when Randy goes to D.C. or I go across the West meeting with congressional people, I'm not always given the warm welcome, let's put it that way.
So
but that would imply I care.
So tell us more about these meetings that you have, Randy. What's it like? And you've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but when you go to D.C. to have these conversations, what's the feedback you're getting? How are people taking your side of this issue?
It's a mix. Some are there supporting our cause. There are some people who are still, feel there's a value in public lands. And then there are some who just say, this is such a low priority list item. Thanks for your time, blah, blah, blah. And then there are those who say, yeah, we're glad to see it's low on the priority list of many because that allows us to accomplish our objective. And so within Congress itself, there's a growing frustration about how federal lands are managed. But they're the ones who can fix the problem. But they don't want to fix it. Okay? So we don't have many timber sales on federal land anymore because in our trade deals, we let the Canadians flood the softwood lumber market. It really doesn't have as much to do with the Forest Service as it does just the market. The Canadians subsidize their logging industry. You get paid for building roads in Canada. Your stumpage is free. There's no tariffs. So the Canadians can flood the softwood lumber market in America anytime they want. Well, Congress could change that and make it more profitable to be a logger, a mill owner in the United States, but they're not going to. Congress could change the fact that states, and they could change the fact of what they charge for a coal royalty or an oil and gas royalty. And here's the flip side of that is whatever state that resource is located in, they get a portion of that royalty, that federal royalty. It gets split with the states and the federal government. So by them keeping that royalty artificially low, they're hurting the states in addition to giving it away to, and this is purely my opinion, they are giving it away as their manner of repaying political favors. I mean, one of the currencies of the West is public resources that get repaid or used to repay political favors. I wish I could say it was different. Sometimes it's quite discreet. Some instances are just so blatant that you just shake your head and say, "Really?"
So kind of like a guy goes, "Hey, I'll help fund your campaign, but you got to make sure I get a little section of this trout stream in Montana."
Or not quite that blatant, but
okay,
we will put a bunch of money in your political campaign, but we want to make sure that oil and gas royalties stay low. Guess what? The guy gets elected. The Secretary of Interior comes forward and says, "We, the BLM, the largest holder of oil and gas interests in North America, think we should raise our royalty rate to be equivalent to the states in which we are operating." That politician who's received all those donations from that group all of a sudden attacks the Secretary of Interior. And then the next day he's out there on the streets complaining how poorly the federal lands are managed and that the states do a better job. I don't mean to pick on oil and gas. I use oil and gas. I'm just using that as an example. It could be, somebody who says, I want to have water rights. I want to have some sort of irrigation rights and make sure that no one else can make a claim and blah, blah, blah. And so they make a donation to a politician, and the politician all of a sudden gums up any resolution of a lot of the water rights adjudications and battles that we have in the West where water is very scarce. It's just so blatant in many instances. It's dumbfounding that they can get by with it. But oh well.
So we're talking a lot about through this whole issue. We're talking about they and them and these people and these organizations. Who are these people? Who are these organizations, Randy? Who are we actually talking about that is supporting this? I think, if we can all decide that this is an important thing, we need to know who we need to start talking to making a difference. So who are these people and organizations?
And that's where it gets to be difficult, because since the Citizen United case that hit the Supreme Court in 2010, and the Supreme Court said that corporations have a right to free speech and that they can participate in elections, and it got rid of a whole bunch of the disclosure requirements and reporting requirements. We don't know who they is or them or that group, because they use 501c4 organizations, 501c9s. I might have that wrong. I know they use 501c4s, where you don't have to disclose who gave you your money, and you can engage in political activities. So we don't really know. Which a lot of people are like, Citizens United, what does that mean? That didn't. Well, it affects us. It allows industries to go and heavily fund political activities without being ratted out, for lack of a better term. And so there's no transparency to understand who donated to this senator or this congressman or congresswoman's cause, and is that affecting their positions on public land policy?
Is it?
You know, you have your I mean, part of it is you get a little feel in these back and forth arguments because you see who shows up as the opposition when you are there promoting a policy that would help improve public land management, and they show up opposed to it. Just by default, they kind of show their hand a little bit.
Is it fair to say that in many cases, or is it fair to assume, maybe I'm wrong here, but from a lot of things I've heard when I've done my own research and looking into this, it seems like a lot of the money that's being put into this type of work is coming from industry. People that would rather extract profit out of these lands, whether it be by sale or, you know, their use of it. That is their motivation, and it sounds like a lot of the motivation and money and energy is coming from that side, pushing a lot of these politicians to say, hey, let's do this because it's good for the economy and it's also good for business. Obviously, we're all pro-business, pro a lot of these things, but at the same time, I imagine there might be something going on there too, right?
We've always in America had industry organizations involve themselves in policy to the extent they can. So a lot of instances you will have a discussion about, okay, this is going to affect water quality. And you'll have somebody who's using the landscape to extract a resource who says, we want the lowest level of regulation because for us to comply with a higher level hurts our profit. And then you might have a community who needs that water for its water source saying, hey, wait a second. We drink this water. This is an absolute fundamental part of living, water. And so very often it is private interests who have either economic value at stake. Sometimes it's just strictly ideological interests at stake. And a lot of times we don't know who it is. It's individuals with really, really big checks that are funding a lot of the campaigns that are the politicians who would like to take your public lands.
So let's talk about that then.
And I just want to preface that, guys, by, you know, my brother's still a logger. My dad was a logger. I would probably be a logger except for the fact that I was the worst logger that ever tried to start a chainsaw. So my dad said, I don't have any money to send you to college, but you better figure it out because you're a terrible logger. So I have nothing against natural resources. I mean, I use them. I'm all in favor of smart use of our resources. But when that discussion then becomes leveraged to a discussion of let's get these public lands out of public hands, then I'm going to stand up and say something about it.
Yeah, there's got to be a threshold. There's got to be some balance. And, you know, like you said, fair use, smart use of some of these things makes all the sense in the world. But if it gets so far out of hand where we're actually getting rid of them or, you know, keeping the public from having the opportunities to use them, whatever it might be, then I think, to your point, then someone needs to stand up and say, okay, things have gotten a little too far in the other direction. So you mentioned campaigns, politics, all those things. So in a lot of cases, we may not know exactly where the money is going, or where it's coming from. But I think in some cases we do know where it's going. It's going to fund certain politicians, certain campaigns, etc. And I personally, Randy, hate getting into politics because it's one of those things that people will automatically put up a wall when they hear certain words or when they hear certain parties or when they hear certain ideas, because we have these these really strong passions or ideologies that are embedded in a lot of us. And what bums me out in a lot of cases is that when you talk parties, sometimes issues become politicized as to one or the other side, and in the way things are going, right, it's a huge divide in between. It's becoming a polarized political system where you are either this or you are that, and if you're that, I hate you, and all that kind of stuff. This is one of those issues that has become politicized and has been adopted by a party, and I worry about that, and it makes it tough for me as a voter too, and I imagine a lot of people listening. Can you speak to this at all? What are we as hunters to do when we look at who to vote for, who to support, when we're seeing some parties and representing the idea of selling off these lands, some parties being in favor of protecting them, but then wanting to take away our rights in other ways. How do you make sense of all this, Randy?
Yeah, it's hard to make sense of, because you're exactly right that we as a society are becoming more and more polarized. We are more and more accepting of I'm this label and someone else is that label. We like this, kind of false dichotomy, this whole idea that if you're not with me on this, you should be against me on everything else, blah, blah, blah. And so we end up in very often a discussion of someone saying, yeah, but I'm good on guns. Yeah, you can be good on guns and good on public land. It's not one or the other. It can be both. And so when we enter these discussions, and I'm a very conservative person. I'm conservative socially, fiscally. I'm definitely right of center. But the unfortunate fact that I cannot deny as a conservative person is every one of these efforts to rid us of the public lands have come from people who are of my same kind of feeling of conservative, small government, frugality, blah, blah, blah. And that frustrates me, because I can make a counter argument that, these public lands, at least where I live, and a lot of other communities, are a huge asset, a huge economic driver. But instantly that person wants to drag me into you're either with me or against me, you're either a Republican or a Democrat, or you're a liberal or a conservative, what are you? Because and it's almost like they want to say, I'm going to be good on guns, but I'm not going to be good on public lands because the other guys are not trying to take your public land, so I got to have a position counter to them. So my position is I got to get rid of these public lands. I'm oversimplifying there, but that's really this politicized environment allows for people to take sides on what I think they take sides based on arguments that are not complete. If the argument was complete, we could have a discussion of, hey, there is a place for public lands. You don't have to be just one or the other. You don't have to feel that because you're good on guns, you have to be bad on public lands, or because you're good on public lands that you have to be bad on guns, or, it doesn't have to be guns. It could be any other issue that is primarily a right or left polar opposite on that topic. But it's a very hard discussion to have. Hunters get drawn into it, and I'm not a Republican and I'm not a Democrat. I am of the hunter, angler, fishing, hunting, access, what's good for the future party is what I am. And any politician who doubts that will quickly learn that if you're on my side, I'll give you all the praise in the world. If you're against me on those topics, I'm coming after you. And I don't really care what party you're with. One of the history of hunting and conservation in America is a remarkable story that goes back 130, 40 years ago, where hunters started this. And it's only been the last 10 to 15 years that we've allowed hunting and conservation and access to become a political issue. It used to be apolitical, where both sides would support what we were doing. And now it's been drawn into the political morass. And we as hunters, one of the problems we have that makes us ill-prepared to do battle over there in the political arena is, one, we just don't like politics. Two, we're kind of loners. We don't like to go out and speak and talk. But probably institutionally the biggest problem we have is most of our advocacy and most of our representation comes through Whitetails Unlimited or Ducks Unlimited or the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, 501c3 organizations, who, by the very nature of the tax code, cannot get involved in lobbying and politics. So these other groups are able to take our issues and drag them over into the political sphere, and we can't do much about it unless we individually engage in that. And when we do individually engage in it, it splits hunting camps. It causes, brothers and cousins to argue about this or that. And when everyone gets frustrated, we just try to divide ourselves along a party line, or a liberal versus the conservative, or whatever. To me, that's exactly how the opposition wins, is when we decide we're going to let it be defined as a R or D, a left or right. This is an issue about hunting and fishing. It's that simple. It's about access. It's about the public lands that someone gave to us that we have responsibility to give to the next generation in a better state than what we received them. And if we can resist the temptation to make it an R or D, a left or right, whatever issue, we're better off. If we can force politicians to say, okay, I'm good on guns, all right, we like that, thank you. Please be good on public lands. Or, I'm good on public lands, okay, please be good on guns. You don't have to be one or the other. You can do both. We have examples out there. So, hey, being involved in the politics of this is kind of a crazy place to be as a hunter, because I really have no use for politics. I don't care what side anyone is on. I just want to know that you are going to do the right thing for the cause that's important to me, hunting, fishing, and access.
Yeah, I can relate to a lot of things you said there. And, I personally, I mentioned this at the beginning of the episode before we brought you on, Randy. I think I did, that, I personally have been going through these kind of oscillations as a person, trying to understand where I fit in the political spectrum and how much attention I pay to it, and all of that. And I came from a conservative background too. That's how I grew up. I have a lot of beliefs that fall in line with some of those groups. At the same time, though, now I most definitely do not define myself any longer as a Republican or Democrat. I fully believe I'm a member, hopefully I think now the second member, of the Hunting and Fishing and Public Lands and Wildlife Habitat Party underneath the leadership of Randy Newberg.
Oh, no, we're going off the cliff.
No, because I think you're absolutely right. I think that this really is, we as hunters and anglers and outdoorsmen and women, we have to resist that temptation to fall prey to this either or mindset, or this, you're either with me or against me and all of these things because this party says we support A, B, and C, so I'm going to support A, B, and C because of it. And as you've mentioned, a couple very important things to outdoors people: the right to bear arms and the right to public access and habitats and productive wildlife populations, unfortunately has been split between parties. And it drives me up the wall, and it frustrates me to no end, and it gets confusing too, because I sit here and I watch CNN and I'm watching what these people are saying, especially in a year like this where the presidential election is going on and all these things are being thrown around, and it's very contentious and lots of emotion and information and misinformation, and it makes it hard to figure out what to do when you believe so strongly in some things that are being split right down the middle by either party, and you have to pick sides. How do you handle that, Randy? How do you approach a year like this, a presidential election year like this, when we're saying, what in the world do I do when there's very important things to me that it's hard to find someone that's checking all the boxes?
Yeah, it is, and I don't think it's realistic to expect we're ever going to find a candidate that agrees with everything one of us feel. But I think it's incumbent upon hunters and anglers and people who enjoy public access to make sure their voice is heard. I think if we as hunters have a fault that's inherent to our personality, that we don't want to ruffle any feathers. We're well-behaved people. We're, we kind of, we'll just take our lump and move forward kind of folks. And I get that. But the rest of the groups, the rest of the people advocating a cause are being the squeaky wheels, and they're getting the grease. And I think we, as our community of outdoors people, need to start being a bit of the squeaky wheel. And I don't expect that whoever's going to win the primary on one side or the other is going to agree with me on everything. There might be one or two of them that don't agree with me on anything. But once they get elected or get their nomination, if we're talking presidentially, and the same thing for whether it's senator, congressperson, governor, whatever, I engage myself to try and influence their perspective on something. I try to get them to understand these issues that are important to me, why they're important to me, and make it a higher priority item for them. And if they don't necessarily agree with me completely on something, I don't just completely write them off or forget about it. A part of our process of government is you have to engage yourself if you want a result. And I feel strongly that if I engage myself, I'm doing as much or maybe more to influence the outcome than the one time every 4 years I go and cast a vote in a ballot. Check the tab or fill in the oval on my ballot. I think my daily activity, my continual interaction with these policymakers has a greater effect on where these outcomes are than where this one person stands and he or she got elected governor or president or senator or whatever. To me, that's the other part of government that happens for 3 years and 364 days other than the election. So who we vote for, everyone's going to determine that. I have no problem voting for a third-party person or a write-in. And some people are going to say, oh, if you do a write-in, that means you're going to let some gun grabber get in. I value my vote more than giving it to the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people feeling that way right now.
How many times have you and your friends sat around and talked politics and said, well, I voted for this person because I thought they were the lesser or the least damaging of two options? I've done that. I'm done with it. I am no longer giving my vote to the lesser of two idiots because in the end I've still voted for an idiot. I will write in a vote or I will vote for a third-party candidate before I will anymore give one of these groups or one of these people who I don't think deserves it something I value as much as I value my vote.
Were you gonna say something, Dan?
Oh no, I was just gonna say that I'm pretty pissed. Like this
At me?
No, not at you. No. This whole conversation we've had is just like got me fired up. Like when we talk about sandbagging, like if I didn't try or at school or I didn't get my work done or my chores done at home, I got slapped across the back of the head by my mom. Yeah. Get your ass in gear, or hey, why did you throw rocks in a parking lot? You break the car windows. That's called common sense, dumbass. Like that kind of stuff.
we need people like you to start showing up at some of these, showing up in D.C. and telling people what's what.
Yeah, I would be that guy's like, get him out of here, and then I'd get tased.
I tell you that I'm the same way. Coming from a logging family, my wife knows that cussing is an art form. And she always reminds me as I'm heading out the door when she drops me off at the airport, now control your temper. Cussing doesn't get you anywhere. But I'm with you. As I'm sure the listeners have probably noticed, my tone and my demeanor has gotten pretty riled up for some of this discussion because this is so important to me, and I don't know how to explain it. It's hard to explain, but if I never shoot another elk in my life, I've shot more than my share. But the fact that someday, 20, 40, 80, 100, 200 years from now, some other Randy Newberg is going to realize his dream of being an elk hunter on public lands, that's important to me. That's more important to me than killing my next elk. And I don't know, maybe I know I've probably been dropped on my head too many times, but I just feel that strongly about it. And I think if there's one thing that has that hunters have stood head and shoulders above the rest of our society, and why we've accomplished so much in the face of such great challenges, what we've done to conserve landscapes and protect species and enhance and increase populations of species, is we kept a vision that was not next week or next month or next quarter or next year. Our vision was always a horizon that was a generation away, or more than one generation away. And if we start lowering our horizons, we're going to aim low and hit even lower in what we accomplish. And I'm not willing to do that. And most of the hunters I talk to, like you, Dan, when you get wound up over this, it's because you share that same thing. You want this to continue. You want it to be better for the next person. And I think that's where we as hunters, sooner or later, our threshold is going to be met, where we're going to get pretty active about this. I hope, if it's not met already, I hope it gets met tomorrow.
So, to that point, I think we need to be encouraging myself and Dan. We need to do a better job of stepping up and starting to take action. I know you already are, Randy, but I hope we can also encourage our listeners to as well. But I guess I do want to not beat around the bush a little bit. And we've talked about the fact that, I hate the fact that it's become so politicized and so partisan. But correct me if I'm wrong, Randy, but this issue of transferring and selling public lands has become a plank in the Republican Party platform. So that's like an official party line now. Is that right?
It is, unfortunately. And the person who, like I said, is socially and fiscally conservative, who, is very, very adamant about the Second Amendment, that disturbs me heavily. And it's not just a national policy issue for that party. At the state level, it's the same thing. 2 years ago, the Montana Republican Party made it a very big deal that they had unanimous vote to add the transfer of these lands as a party platform plank. And it's just like, who's leading this? Who's doing the thinking for them? And after my disappointment, I sat back and looked at it and said, well, here's how politics works these days. You get some consultant to come and tell you the polling data says this, or here's a strategy of how we're going to accomplish X, Y, or Z. And so these party bosses, whether they're state party bosses or national party bosses, lean heavily on consultants for forming these positions on topics they don't know much about. And if the other side has done one really good thing, it's that they have invested tons of money in highly paid, slick-talking consultants to come to the party bosses and make the sales pitch that selling the public lands is good for the party. And that's how that stuff gets in there.
So
it sounds screwed up, but that's how a lot of that stuff gets in there.
Yeah, it does sound screwed up. And I guess with that being the case, right, I too feel that same disappointment. And like I mentioned, I definitely have a background similar to yours too, Randy, it sounds like. And I don't care if you're listening right now, I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat or in the hunting, angling, outdoors party or wherever you stand on these issues. If you do have the passion that I think most of us do have about these landscapes, these habitats, access to them to hunt and fish and do all these other things, we need to start taking action on it. And historically, there's probably a majority of hunters would fall towards the conservative side, would fall towards the Republican side. So let's just say, let's go with that assumption. Let's just say that the majority of people right now listening might be leaning in the Republican way. I don't care either way, but let's just hypothetically say that's the case. If that's the case, and given the fact that right now, like you mentioned, Randy, a party line, like a goal within the Republican Party now, at least from the top level, is to sell off or transfer these public lands. To your point a couple minutes ago, Randy, we, the people, or anyone who wants to be involved with those politicians or wants to support them, it's our job to go and say, hey, that's a really stupid idea. I want to support a lot of the things that you do and that you work towards, but that is something that we can't have. And so we need to start, like you said, being that greasy wheel. Because it doesn't need to be an either or between being good on guns or individual rights or whatever it is, and habitat, public access, all of that. So whichever party or wherever you place yourself, we need to be talking to our representatives, our senators, all these other people, presidential candidates, and saying, hey, this is a really important issue, and there's a lot of people and a lot of communities and a lot of businesses and a whole lot of different things that are going to be impacted by this. Let's make sure you're going in the right direction.
Yeah, and often I hear people say, well, I don't want to upset them because they're good on guns. Right? And I get that. But why are we not afraid? So we've kind of used the assumption that most hunters are right of center, and that all the data shows that to be true, and that's why we're disappointed when the party further to the right supports this. But let's take the mirror and go the other way, and just about all gun legislation that restricts the Second Amendment comes from the Democratic side. Why do we not have any hesitation about writing a letter, making a comment, or giving that Democratic legislator or senator or congressperson how we feel about certain gun issues when it's detrimental to us? But for some reason, we refuse to convey the same frustration or the same feelings when it's a Republican who's doing something on the other side on public lands. I don't understand the thought process that gives someone the comfort in saying, oh, why do you do this on my guns, but yet they're afraid that they'll offend someone if they go say the same thing on public lands to someone on the other side. Maybe I'm too simple-minded to understand that hesitation, but I just think that we are at that point where hunters are going to have to speak up for their own cause and engage with these politicians. If you know a county commissioner, if you know a state legislator, if you know someone at a local level, that person hearing your concerns, and if they hear it from enough of you, will carry it to the next level, who carries it to the next level. They say all politics is local, and to some degree it is. If you have a congressperson in your district who gets 12 calls and emails from on the same topic, they're going to tell a staffer, go find out what's going on there. Because if 12 people call, that means there's probably 12,000 people who feel the same way just in that little area. So it does make a difference. I know we feel at times that the big money machines and the big political parties on both sides control the argument, and they do to some degree. But nothing scares a politician more than a group of pissed off hunters.
For good reason.
Yeah. I mean, not because we're going to show up armed, but because when you piss us off, we plan to do something about it. And we're good at hunters, when they do finally get mad enough, are good at getting people unelected.
Well, I certainly hope and I expect that that's going to be the case moving forward, that regardless of where we individually feel we fit within the party spectrum, if you are left or right or center or whatever it is, hopefully I think all of us hunters and outdoorsmen and women and people that appreciate the incredible resource we have of these public lands, that we can all kind of decide that, yeah, this is something that needs to be sorted out, needs to be taken care of, and we'll talk to our representatives regardless of what party they may be and say, hey, this needs to be a priority. We need to refocus our attention here. And I hope of everyone listening today that you can take Randy's advice and be that greasy wheel. Speak to your representatives. We don't need to settle for either or. We don't need to settle for take all the above and you're stuck with it. I think we need to start taking an active interest and an active role in informing the direction of where things are going to go. It's time that we don't just let things go idly by and roll with it. I think we need to really start forming that path forward. So
I agree.
Randy, this has been really helpful. I think this is one of those topics that is evidenced by the fact that we've just talked about it for over an hour and a half. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of questions. Yeah.
Gosh, sorry, guys.
No.
I apologize to your audience. They're probably They probably dropped the line a long time ago. Saying, "Get that knucklehead off the wire." Gee.
I hope not. Although Dan did drop off, so that might be evidence of he actually had to go take care of family stuff. But no, this has been terrific, and I'm really glad that you could share your experience and background and knowledge of all these things, because it's something that, yeah, it's starting to show up in the media, the hunting and outdoors media more, which is a good thing. It's still something that there's a lot of questions about, and my goal here was to really try to answer some of those questions, get people thinking about it, get people hopefully ready to start taking some action, and I think you were able to really help us take a step in that direction. So,
Mark, thanks so much. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anywhere, and I know there is, but would you like to share with our audience where they can go to hear more from you, your opinions and thoughts on any of these other things, or just to get some more Randy Newberg in their life?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, Mark. And one thing I'm going to definitely do with my following is to share your podcast with all of my folks who watch my TV show and listen to my podcast. If people are interested, I've done some episodes of my podcast. It's called Hunt Talk Radio, Randy Newberg Unfiltered. I've done some episodes specific to a few of the topics we've talked about today. They can just get that out on iTunes or Stitcher, or you can go to our YouTube channel. Now we're loading our podcast episodes right up on our YouTube channel, and it's called Randy Newberg Hunter. And we would love to see all of your listeners who maybe are primarily whitetail hunters, love to see them all also get a taste of the West, and get the addiction for elk, mule deer, antelope, whitetail, whatever out here. And if they're interested in that, we have the big forum called hunttalk.com where we talk about everything related to public land hunting, and we help people apply for tags, figure out drawing systems, a lot of really good stuff out there. So when my TV show isn't airing in quarters 3 and 4, those are the best places to reach me, either on the Hunt Talk forum, listen to our podcast, or check out our YouTube channel. So.
And your YouTube channel now has old episodes of your shows, right?
Right. Yeah, we're actually, our old show, On Your Own Adventures, we've loaded those 4 seasons up. And now in the next month, we're going to start loading up the last 3 seasons we've produced, which are titled under the new show called Fresh Tracks with Randy Newberg. So if people go out there and hit the subscribe button, and it doesn't cost you anything to hit the subscribe button, it's not like you're paying a fee to subscribe, but hitting the subscribe button on our YouTube channel means that you will get notified when we load up a new episode. And so far it's turned out great. The traffic is just growing like crazy. I did not know that many people really cared about Randy Newberg stumbling around in the woods trying to hurt himself. So maybe they're just bored in the winter. I don't know.
There certainly is probably a little bit of that, at least for those people who are listening to this podcast, because if they're listening to this show, they must be feeling the same way. But I do highly recommend anyone listening, if you haven't already, take Randy up on that offer. I'm subscribed to the YouTube channel. I'm subscribed to his podcast, and I check out Hunt Talk, and all the above are great resources for both just entertaining and interesting, but also educational. Randy, as you've heard over the last hour and a half or so, has got a lot of great perspective and experience on some of these important issues to all hunters. So definitely check it out. And your website, Randy, is randynewberg.com, right?
Yeah, randynewberg.com will give you links to every one of our platforms. So that's kind of the clearinghouse where, when in doubt, go to randynewberg.com and you'll find a link to all of our platforms.
Perfect. Well, I think with that, we'll wrap things up, Randy. So again, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Mark. I'm not going to let you go without you making a promise.
And what's that?
This summer you're going to come to Bozeman, and we're going to get together, and you're going to be on my podcast, and we're going to go fishing or something.
I will accept that and promise you to take you up on that, because that sounds like a lot of fun.
All right, Mark. Thanks so much. I appreciate all you do. I appreciate your listeners. They're great folks, and keep carrying on. I really appreciate it.
Sounds great, Randy. I'll see you this summer.
Yep. Bye.
All right, bye-bye. All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation, found it helpful, educational, and maybe put a little fire underneath your butt to take some action on these things. I appreciate you sticking with us here on an extra long episode, but hopefully you'll agree that this was an important enough topic for us to do that. So thank you for your time. Speaking of thanks, we do need to thank our partners who have helped make this podcast possible. So big thank you to Sitka Gear, Trophy Ridge, Bear Archery, Redneck Blinds, Huntera Maps, Ozonics, Lacrosse Boots, and the Whitetail Institute of North America. And one other thing that I forgot to mention was that there's a petition you can sign at the URL is sportsmansaccess.org. And that's a petition to support our public lands and say that, hey, we do not want these to be transferred or sold. So check out sportsmansaccess.org for more information on this topic, as well as the resources we mentioned earlier at Randy Newberg's website and podcast. All the above will be super helpful in addition to what we talked about here today. So with that all said, thank you again for joining us. I appreciate it. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.